It was supposed to be the perfect escape, a weekend to leave behind the world and its demands, to lose myself in the raw, unspoiled beauty of nature. But I never imagined that what started as a quiet retreat would spiral into the most horrifying experience of my life. My name is Martin Calhoun, and this is how a simple RV camping trip turned into a waking nightmare. The RV park was nestled deep in the wilderness of northern Idaho, far from civilization. Towering pines loomed over the area, and the distant murmur of the river created a soundtrack that promised serenity. I picked this place specifically for its isolation. Work had been draining me, and I needed a break, a chance to breathe, to recharge. I arrived early Friday morning and was greeted by the park's sole caretaker, Elwood McKinley. A grizzled man in his late 50s, Elwood's weathered face and leathery skin told the story of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. He gave me a quick rundown of the park and, with a gravelly voice, warned, "Keep an eye out for bears. Had a sighting last week. Store your food right, and you'll be fine." I thanked him, not overly concerned. I'd camped in bear country before and knew the drill. I had all the proper precautions in place, and the RV was more than equipped for a safe, relaxing stay. After setting up camp, I spent the afternoon fishing, the river generously offering up a couple of trout for my dinner. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the forest, a sense of peace enveloped me. This was exactly what I needed. Nightfall brought a quiet calm, the kind that only deep wilderness can provide. I cooked my fish over a small fire, savoring the simple pleasure. But as the shadows of the forest deepened, the peace shattered. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but then I heard something else. Faint whispers, indistinct, barely audible voices, weaving through the rustling sounds. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to hear more clearly. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. There was more than one voice now, and something primal inside me told me I was not alone. I grabbed my flashlight, my pulse quickening, and approached the window, peering into the suffocating darkness. A shape moved between the trees. No, not just one, dozens of them. Figures, half hidden by shadows, murmuring to each other. Then I saw it, a face. Wild, dirt smeared, eyes wide and gleaming with madness, grinning like a predator. The man recoiled at the light, hissing like some animal caught in a trap. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my phone, but of course there was no signal. My only hope was the ranger station a mile away. Elwood's voice echoed in my mind. "Landline there!" I grabbed a hunting knife and flashlight, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and dashed into the night. The forest, once tranquil, now felt like a labyrinth of threats. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more desperate. I dared a glance behind me and saw them, figures closing in from all sides, their movements fluid and unnerving. They were hunting me. I ran harder, the light from my flashlight bouncing erratically as I raced toward the station. The sound of footsteps was right behind me, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close. I reached the ranger station and slammed my fists against the door, desperate for Elwood to answer. Nothing. I remembered the spare key hidden under a loose floorboard on the porch. My hands trembled as I dug it out, unlocked the door, and slipped inside. The station was dark and empty. I found the landline and dialed 911, my heart thudding in my chest. The phone rang and rang. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. Suddenly, a sound from outside froze my blood. Something was being dragged. I peered out the window and saw Elwood's body, lifeless and limp, being pulled by two men. Their faces were twisted with that same madness, their eyes hollow and feral. I dropped below the window, trying to steady my breathing, my mind racing. I was trapped. The whispers were growing louder now, filling the silence with their deranged murmurs. I needed to defend myself. I searched through the station and found an old rifle. My hands were slick with sweat as I loaded it, every second stretching like an eternity. Then the door handle rattled. I aimed at the door, finger tight on the trigger, and waited. The door creaked open. A head peeked through the gap, and without thinking, I fired. The shot rang out like thunder in the dead of night, and the man collapsed in a heap on the floor. The other man screamed in fury, a guttural, raw sound, and my pulse surged with dread. I had seconds. I dragged the body inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it again, my mind scrambling. I searched the man's body. No identification. Nothing to explain why he was here. Then I peeked out the window again. The remaining man was pacing, holding a bloody knife, his face contorted into a snarl. He spotted me, and his gaze locked with mine. I knew he was coming for me. I had to get out. Fast. I remembered the back door that led to the supply shed. I moved quickly, unlocking it, slipping out, and locking it behind me. The shed was cramped, filled with rusted tools and old equipment. I grabbed a wrench, the cold metal heavy in my hand. The man's footsteps were getting closer. The whispers were now screams. I hid behind a stack of boxes, my heart hammering in my chest. The door creaked open and the man stepped inside. He was scanning the room, moving slowly, methodically. The moment was now or never. I swung the wrench with all my strength. It connected with his skull with a sickening crack. He staggered, dazed, and I struck again, harder this time. He crumpled to the ground unconscious. I didn't wait to see if he would wake up. I grabbed his knife and ran, desperate to make it back to the RV, to the safety of the vehicle I had taken for granted just hours ago. The path back felt like a maze of terror. Every sound, every rustling twig sent me into a panic. When I finally reached the RV, I saw the body of the first man still lying outside the ranger station. I didn't hesitate. I jumped inside, locked the door, and tried to start the engine. It sputtered, refused to start. Panic flooded my chest as I tried again. The seconds stretched into eternity. And then, bang! The back of the RV exploded with a violent thud. I turned around and saw him. He had somehow followed me. Bloodied, his face twisted with rage. He lunged and we grappled. The RV was cramped and there was no room to move. He slashed at me with a knife. I fought back, desperately reaching for anything. My hand gripped the frying pan and I swung it at his head. It connected with a sickening thud and he stumbled backward, dazed. I didn't waste the chance. I tackled him, pinning him to the ground, and pummeled him until he stopped moving. Blood covered my hands. I was breathing hard, shaking, every muscle aching with the adrenaline that still surged through me. I pushed his body off, grabbed the keys from the counter, and started the RV. This time, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove through the night, my mind reeling, trying to process the madness I had just survived. I didn't understand it. Why? Why had these men attacked me? What had driven them to such madness? When I reached the nearest town just as dawn broke, I pulled into a gas station and called the police. They arrived quickly, taking my statement and sending officers to the RV park. The police found the bodies and the evidence of the struggle. They confirmed what I feared. The men had been part of a local cult, one that had been terrorizing the area for months. Their leader had been captured, and the rest were hunting anyone they could find. I was treated for my injuries and given a place to stay for the night, but the shock was still fresh, gnawing at my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker than I could comprehend had touched me that night. The next morning, I left the RV park, never looking back. But I couldn't forget. And I promised myself that I would never, ever return to a place that could hide such horrors beneath its peaceful facade. I had survived. That was all that mattered. The desert had always seemed a place of clarity, a vast, unbroken expanse where silence held dominion and time moved sluggishly, measured by the slow erosion of stone. That was why I chose Chiaha National Monument for my escape. Grief had weighed on me like lead since my sister's death, pulling me into restless nights and empty days. I needed the solitude. Or maybe I was just running. Echo Canyon was far from everything. The campsite perched on the edge of jagged towers of rock called hoodoos, natural monoliths shaped by wind and rain over countless centuries. They loomed like petrified giants, frozen mid-stride, casting grotesque shadows in the fading sunlight as I parked my RV. I wanted peace. But the silence here felt wrong. It was thick and oppressive, like a presence waiting just out of sight. That first night, the stars were bright, the air cool, and the fire crackled softly. It should have been comforting, but the wind twisted through the hoodoos in a way that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It carried faint whispers, shifting, broken murmurs that prickled the edge of comprehension. I dismissed them as tricks of the mind, the strange acoustics of the canyon. But the longer I listened, the more those whispers seemed deliberate, almost beckoning. When I strained to make sense of them, they stopped abruptly, like they were aware of me listening. Unnerved, I retreated into the RV. I locked the door and closed every window, yet the whispers persisted, faint but insistent, crawling just beneath the edge of hearing. Sleep was fleeting and filled with fractured images of shadowed forms moving through the rocks. The next morning, I forced myself to explore. The sun rose warm and relentless, casting the hoodoos into sharp relief. The trail led me to a dry creek bed, its stones polished and pale, etched with strange symbols that seemed both ancient and alien. Circles, spirals, jagged lines, none of them made sense to me, but they hummed with an unplaceable unease. As I knelt to examine them, a low, mournful wail rose from the canyon. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It began as a subtle hum, before swelling into a keening scream that seemed to come from the rocks themselves, ricocheting through the canyon with a terrible vitality. It was almost a voice, almost human, but not quite. The hairs on my arms stood up as I backed away, every instinct telling me I wasn't alone. That night, I returned to the RV to find deep scratches gouged into the metal sides. They hadn't been there before. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the marks. Something or someone had been here. And then the whispers came again, louder now, curling through the air like a sinister melody. My flashlight cast jittery beams into the darkness, but nothing moved. Nothing but the shadows of the rocks. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek bed, barely illuminated by the moonlight. A figure draped in white, her long hair obscuring her face. Her shoulders shook as though racked by sobs. Every rational thought screamed for me to get back inside, but I couldn't. My legs moved of their own accord, drawing me closer. "Are you okay?" My voice cracked as I called out. She didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, she was gone. The emptiness where she'd been felt heavier than her presence. That night, I dreamed of her. I stood in the creek bed, and she was beside me, her face hidden, but her cries piercing the still air. I reached out to touch her, but the ground collapsed beneath me. Black water surged up, pulling me under as her skeletal hands clawed at me, dragging me deeper. Her whispers became screams, screams that echoed my sister's voice. I woke gasping, sweat-soaked and freezing. The heater was dead, the air in the RV impossibly cold. My journal lay open on the table, and scrawled across the page were jagged, trembling words. "Why didn't you save her?" They weren't mine, but they spoke to the guilt that had devoured me since my sister's death. By the third night, the figure in white was a constant presence. She loomed at the edge of the campsite, closer each time. Her cries filled the canyon, guttural and desperate, drowning out the whispers that now carried my voice and my sister's in an eerie, dissonant chorus. The scratches on the RV deepened, and the oppressive sense of being watched grew unbearable. I couldn't run. Not from her. Not from my guilt. Clutching the bracelet my sister had given me, a small silver charm, the only thing I'd kept of hers, I stumbled into the canyon, following the whispers to the creek bed. The air grew colder with each step, the sound building into a deafening storm. She appeared before me, her white figure stark against the shadows. Her hair lifted in an unfelt wind, and for the first time I saw her face. skeletal, hollow, her eyes burning with anguish and rage. When she screamed, it was as though the earth itself trembled beneath me. I dropped to my knees, holding out the bracelet. "I'm sorry," I whispered. My voice broke. "I'm sorry I couldn't save her." The scream faltered and she froze. The wind stilled, the whispers dying into silence. Slowly she reached for the bracelet, her skeletal hand brushing against it. A single tear fell from the hollow of her eye before she dissolved into the wind, scattering like ash. As I stumbled back to the RV, the scratches were gone, the heater humming back to life as though nothing had happened. But the bracelet was missing, left behind in the creek bed as a final offering. When I drove away the next morning, I caught a fleeting glimpse of her in the rearview mirror, a figure in white, standing sentinel among the hoodoos, watching me leave. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest lifted, and I could finally breathe. The desert has a peculiar way of rearranging your thoughts. It strips you bare, unravels the tightly wound threads of your mind, and exposes the raw nerves of your deepest fears and desires. It doesn't just change what you think, it changes how you think. That's why I came to Death Valley. The promise of vast, unending silence, where the noise of my crumbling life and the chaos in my mind could finally dissolve. My name is Evan Thomas, and until recently, I had lived tethered to dual monitors, endless lines of code, and the constant ping of urgent emails. My life was consumed by the grind, by the constant demands of work until the day Mia left. It felt like I lost an anchor, as if the earth itself had ripped from beneath my feet, and all that remained was emptiness. The migraines started not long after, sharp, blinding, and relentless. They blurred the line between reality and something else, something darker. That's when I decided to disconnect, to really disconnect. I chose my 1980s era RV for the journey. I called it the Voyager. A fitting name, I thought, for my journey into solitude, into a place where I could disappear. No distractions, no memories, no pain. As I drove into the heart of Death Valley, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The beauty of it nearly stole my breath, momentarily locking my inner turmoil in place. But only for a moment. My first night was spent near Furnace Creek, the area abandoned, a perfect reflection of my fractured mind. I managed a small fire, the flames flickering against the darkness. I sat under the vast sky, letting the silence suffocate me. That's when the weirdness began. The old radio in the Voyager, a relic from another time, crackled to life. It was supposed to be for show, a useless piece of nostalgia. But suddenly, a voice, calm to calm, spoke through the static. The words echoed through the RV's thin walls. "Come to the crossroads, Evan. Come tonight." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat prickling at my skin. I rubbed my temples, trying to dismiss it as a stress-induced hallucination. I'd been pushing myself too hard. But when I tried to sleep, the voice haunted the edges of my dreams, a soft, repetitive whisper that curled around the darkness like a snake. "Come to the crossroads. Evan, come tonight." The next day, I tried to ignore it, to push it aside. I hiked up one of the park's easier trails, desperate for some distraction. But that's when I saw him, the figure. He stood in the distance, just a dark shape against the barren landscape. At first, I thought it was a mirage, but as I blinked, he seemed to be closer. I rubbed my eyes, my heart beginning to race. Every time I looked away, then back, he was nearer still. I approached, but when I got close, he vanished. "Come to the crossroads, Evan. Come tonight." The voice was back, carried by the wind, a whisper that slithered into my mind. I tried to shake it off, but the air around me seemed to grow heavier, the silence oppressive. By the time I returned to the Voyager, night had already claimed the desert. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to confront whatever was calling to me. I couldn't live with these hallucinations any longer. I climbed into the RV and drove under the dying light, my headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The radio crackled once more, the voice now oddly comforting in the suffocating black. "You're close, Evan. Don't turn back." I didn't. I couldn't. The gravel crunched beneath the Voyager's tires as I reached the crossroads. The desert was still. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I parked and stepped out into the biting cold of the night. The silence pressed in on me like a vice. And then there, standing in the center of the crossroads, was the figure. He was no longer just a silhouette. He was real. He was both old and ageless, his face a blend of time itself, a reflection of everything I had tried to escape. His eyes, though, they were my eyes, the same ones that stared back at me in the mirror every morning. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice small, trembling. "To confront what you've been avoiding, Evan," he said. His voice wasn't just a voice, it was the desert itself, a thousand whispers carried on the wind. Your past, your pain, your reality. A surge of anger flooded me. You're not real. You're just a figment of my broken mind. Am I? He stepped closer, his form shifting with the air, blending with the night around us. Or am I here to show you what's buried deep inside? To help you face it so you can move forward? His words cut through me like a knife, the weight of them nearly crushing me. The desert, the night, the stillness, everything seemed to pulse with the echo of his words. We stood there, suspended between time, between reality and madness. The crossroads had become a place where everything I had tried to outrun was now staring me in the face. He began to fade, dissolving into the night like smoke. Remember, Evan, healing begins when you accept the journey, no matter how hard it may be. I woke the next morning with the first rays of sunlight casting a soft, golden glow over the desert. The figure was gone, the radio was silent. But something inside me had shifted, a subtle realignment of my thoughts, my fears, my very understanding of what had happened to me. I packed up the Voyager, and as I drove away, I looked at the desert differently. It was no longer just an empty wasteland. It was a place where I had faced myself, where I had started to mend. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be more crossroads, more decisions to face. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to meet them. The Black Hills had always been a place of refuge, the kind of isolation I needed after losing Sarah. I had learned to embrace solitude. It was easier than facing the pity of others or hearing the advice they offered when they had no idea what I was really going through. Out here, surrounded by towering pines and an unbroken sky, it felt like I could finally breathe, or at least pretend to. I parked my RV in the farthest spot on the loop, near a narrow dirt trail that led deeper into the forest. This was the kind of place Sarah and I used to explore together. She loved the wilderness. Now, wandering the woods without her felt like trying to fill a cup with holes in the bottom. The first night was unsettling. The forest, usually alive with sounds, was dead silent. No wind to rustle the trees, no crickets or owls, just an oppressive stillness that pressed in on me from all sides. It felt suffocating. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A soft snap, a branch breaking, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps circling my RV. I held my breath, straining to hear, praying it would pass. It did, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I sat outside with my coffee, the sun struggling to cut through the thick canopy above, when a man appeared from the trail. He was gaunt, his face pale as if drained of color. His clothes were filthy, yet he waved at me like we were old friends. "Hey there," he called, his voice hoarse. "Mind if I sit?" I nodded, wary but polite. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp. There was something in his expression, something too eager that made my stomach churn. "I'm Max," he said, dropping onto the bench across from me. "Been out here for a few days. Saw your RV and thought, finally, someone else. You can't be alone out here." "Ethan," I replied, my voice tight. His eyes flickered toward the trail behind me. "You notice anything weird out here?" he asked. His voice dropped, eyes narrowing. "Sounds or someone watching you?" My stomach twisted. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? Max leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. There's a stranger. Been following me since I got here. Skinny, pale, doesn't say a word, just watches. Every time I stop, he's closer. I think he wants me to follow him. But I won't. Can't trust him. His words were so calm, so matter of fact that for a moment I didn't know how to respond. It sounded crazy, but the way he said it, like he truly believed it, sent a chill down my spine. And then I remembered the footsteps last night, the sound of something, or someone, circling my RV. Have you seen him? Max asked, his voice insistent. I hesitated. No. You will, he said grimly. He always shows up. Max stayed near the campsite for the rest of the day, pacing between his trail and my RV, his nervous energy contagious. By dusk, I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see the figure he described. That night, I heard it again. The knocking. Soft at first, like someone tapping on the RV's door. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, but the clearing was empty. The forest, dark and looming, felt suffocating. Then, through the trees, I saw him, the figure, pale, gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes. He stood just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching. Hey, I called, my voice cracking, but the figure didn't respond. I shone the flashlight at him, but the beam seemed to disappear into the dark. I took a step closer, and just as quickly, he was gone. The next morning, Max looked worse. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking as if he hadn't slept in days. You saw him, didn't you? He rasped. I don't know what I saw, I admitted, my voice low. You saw him, Max insisted, his voice a frantic whisper. He's getting closer. What does he want? I asked. Max shook his head. To take us. That's what he does. Lures you deeper into the woods and you never come back. His words settled over me like a weight. I wanted to tell him it was all in his head, that he was just scared. But the image of that figure from the night before, silent and unmoving, stuck with me. I started noticing things around the campsite. Scratches on the RV windows, footprints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were Max's, but the size was wrong. The stride was too long, too deliberate. Max was becoming more erratic. He jumped at every sound, accusing me of bringing the stranger closer. You're broken, he hissed one night, his eyes wild. That's why he's here. He can smell it on you. I snapped back, anger flaring. You think you're any different? You're the one running. Max's eyes darkened. Maybe I am, but at least I'm not feeding him. By the third night, I was ready to leave, but something kept me there. A part of me wanted answers, even if I didn't want the truth. I stayed up late, listening to the sounds outside. That's when I realized Max was gone. I stepped outside, calling his name. No answer. A faint trail of footprints led into the woods. My gut told me to stay, but something darker, stronger, pulled me forward. I had to know. The forest was darker than it should have been. The moonlight barely cut through the canopy, the trees pressing in around me. The trail twisted and turned, and I kept calling for Max, but the only answer was the eerie echo of my own voice. Then I saw them. Max was standing in a clearing, motionless. The stranger stood opposite him, their faces inches apart. Max was whispering, his words too soft to hear. The stranger tilted its head as though listening. Max, I called, stepping into the clearing. Max turned to me, his face blank. It's okay, Ethan, he said, his voice distant. I can go if I bring him someone else. I froze. What the hell are you talking about? He wants you, Max whispered, his voice trembling. You're what he's been waiting for. The stranger's head snapped toward me. My chest tightened as I stumbled back, but Max grabbed my arm, his grip tight as iron. I'm sorry, he said, his eyes wide with terror. It's the only way. I shoved him away, rage and panic flooding me. Get off me! The stranger moved, slow but purposeful, its pale form stretching and warping like smoke. I scrambled for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam flickered and the stranger recoiled, a hiss like shattering glass filling the air. But it didn't retreat. Not completely. Desperate, I grabbed a branch from the ground, using my lighter to set it on fire. The flames cast jagged shadows, and the stranger hesitated, tilting its head as if confused. I held the torch high, forcing the creature back, but it only hissed louder, retreating into the trees. I dragged Max back to the campsite, his body limp, but his eyes wide with fear. "He'll come back," he muttered, barely able to speak. "He always comes back." At dawn, I packed my things. Max refused to leave. He insisted the stranger would follow me if I tried. I didn't argue. Whatever this was, I wanted no part of it. As I drove away, the forest seemed to breathe around me. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the road, and in the rearview mirror, I saw him, the stranger, standing in the clearing, still as death, watching me. I don't know if it will follow me, but I know this: some places in the world aren't meant to be understood. The Black Hills are one of them. On the Road had always been a place of reflection for me, a ribbon winding through my thoughts as much as through the landscapes. Since Lila's passing, these journeys in our old RV, which we affectionately named Wanderlust, became my solace and my penance. Lassen Volcanic National Park was to be a checkpoint, a name on the long list Lila and I had compiled during our twilight years together. Spring was supposed to have been kinder, but as I maneuvered Wanderlust through the snowy roads of Lawson, the flurries grew into a blizzard. I'd read about sudden weather changes here, but nothing quite prepares you for the isolation it brings. Setting up camp near Manzanita Lake, I tried to focus on the stillness of the white-covered pines and the soft blanket of snow that transformed the landscape into a winter wonderland. But the cold was biting, more so with Wanderlust's stubborn heater deciding it was time to retire. The first night, wrapped in layers of blankets, I listened to the wind howl like a gathering of spirits outside. In the morning, my breath visible in the frigid air, I discovered my previous day's tracks to the lake had been erased and replaced. The new set were larger, with a stride longer than any human's. Curiosity piqued. I followed the tracks until they vanished into the thicket. Each night, I saw them, blue lights flickering in the distance across the frozen lake. They danced like fireflies trapped in winter's grip. I rationalized them as a trick of the eye, refracted moonlight perhaps, but my heart leaned towards something more, something otherworldly. On the third day, trapped by another surge of snow and haunted by the vision of those lights, I decided to confront the mystery head on. Bundling up, I trekked towards the source, my steps muffled by the fresh snow. The closer I got, the clearer the lights became, a soft, mournful blue that pulsed in the rhythm of a sad heart. As I reached the edge of a clearing, I saw them, figures enveloped in an ethereal glow, their forms shimmering against the stark white of the snow. They did not notice me at first. The figures were reenacting some desperate measure, gathering invisible wood, their motions repetitive and sorrowful. It was then I realized they were the remnants of a lost expedition, souls trapped in their last moments, forever trying to stave off the cold that had claimed their lives. My heart ached with a widower's grief, understanding all too well the pain of being caught in an endless loop of sorrow. I approached, my voice gentle, breaking the eerie silence. "I'm here to help," I murmured, though I wasn't sure they could hear me. As if my words were a spell, the figures paused, turning towards me. Their eyes were hollow with despair, their faces gaunt, shaped by the merciless cold. One of them, a man wearing a tattered expedition coat, stepped forward. His voice was a whisper carried by the wind. "Help us warm, help us leave." I nodded, unsure how to assist, but driven by a resolve to try. I returned to Wanderlust, gathering blankets, an unopened bottle of whiskey, and my emergency food supplies. Setting up a makeshift campfire back in the clearing, I laid out the blankets around it and placed the food and whiskey nearby. Night had fallen by the time I finished, and the temperature dropped further. I lit the fire, the flames casting a warm glow. The spirits watched, their blue light mingling with the fire's orange. One by one, they approached, drawn to the warmth they had not felt in decades. They did not eat nor drink, but they gathered around the fire, their blue light slowly fading into a peaceful white. The man in the expedition coat spoke again, his voice stronger now. "You've given us what we yearned for, warmth and remembrance." As the fire died down, so did their light. By the time the first rays of dawn touched the snowy clearing, they were gone. In their place, lying in the snow near where the fire had been, was a small leather-bound journal. I picked it up, the leather cold and stiff. The journal was filled with entries from the expedition leader, detailing their journey and eventual demise. Holding the journal close, I felt a bridge form between the past and present, a connection through shared humanity and compassion. I knew then what I needed to do. My journey wasn't just about seeing new places or escaping the past pain of my loss. It was about understanding and connecting, about finding stories that needed to be told. As I drove away from Lawson, leaving the spirits and the cold behind, I planned my next destination. There were more parks to visit, more echoes of the past to listen to, and more forgotten stories to revive. Wanderlust was more than just a vehicle. It was a vessel carrying me through grief to healing, and perhaps in time to a new beginning. The story of the Frost of the Forgotten would be my first chapter. I've never been one for city life. The hustle and bustle just wasn't for me. So I bought an old RV and decided to spend my weekends camping in the remote parts of the United States. This particular trip took me to the dense forests of northern Idaho, a place known for its solitude and breathtaking beauty. I'm Ralph Turner, a simple guy with a love for the outdoors. I've had my share of hard times, including a nasty divorce that left me preferring the company of trees and streams to people. This trip was supposed to be a therapeutic escape, a way to clear my mind and reset. I arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. The place was deserted, which was perfect. I set up my RV, unpacked my gear, and took a moment to breathe in the fresh pine-scented air. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, a symphony of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. After setting up camp, I decided to explore the area. I grabbed my map and set off on a trail that led deeper into the forest. The trail was well marked but rarely used, the ground covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves. As I walked, I noticed the forest getting denser and darker, the tall trees blocking out most of the sunlight. I was a few miles in when I saw something odd, a series of carvings on the trees, symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar. They seemed to be leading somewhere, so I decided to follow them. Curiosity got the better of me. The symbols led me to a small clearing where I found the remnants of what looked like an old campsite. There was a dilapidated tent, a rusted campfire grill, and some scattered belongings. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was probably just an abandoned camp, nothing more. I spent some time looking through the old campsite, but there wasn't much to see. As the sun began to set, I decided to head back to my RV. I followed the trail back, but something felt off. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nature completely absent. I quickened my pace, my heart beginning to race. When I reached my campsite, I noticed something strange. The door to my RV was ajar, and my belongings were scattered all over the place. I walked in cautiously, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I been robbed? Was someone still inside? I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and slowly made my way through the RV. It was empty, but it was clear that someone had been there. My food supplies were gone, my maps were torn, and my first aid kit had been raided. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Who would do this? I spent the next hour trying to clean up the mess, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise made me jump. I decided to lock myself in the RV for the night. I figured I'd pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises outside, footsteps and whispers. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I finally fell asleep. I woke up to the sound of a loud bang. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously peered out the window. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I couldn't stay in the RV. I had to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I was about to start the RV, I noticed something on the windshield. It was a handprint smeared with what looked like blood. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a random break-in. Someone was out there, and they were watching me. I started the RV and drove out of there as fast as I could. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an eerie light through the trees. As I drove down the winding forest road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. I didn't slow down to get a better look. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a small town. I went straight to the police station and reported what had happened. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Just another crazy camper, they probably thought. I never went back to that forest. I sold the RV and decided that maybe city life wasn't so bad after all. But I still think about that night, about the abandoned campsite and the handprint on my windshield. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm glad I got out when I did. The Black Canyon of the Gunnison was unlike any place I'd ever been. Its cliffs didn't simply rise, they loomed, jagged and unyielding, like a force of nature daring anyone to step closer. The Gunnison River roared far below, a constant, guttural growl that seemed to claw at the very air. For some, this place might have been intimidating, but for me, it was perfect. It felt like the kind of place where I could face myself or disappear. I parked my RV near the rim of the canyon, a solitary spot offering a view that was both breathtaking and oppressive. The shadows stretched long across the gorge as the sun sank lower, casting the narrow walls into an early twilight. It suited me. Shadows and isolation, that was all I deserved. I didn't come here to relax. I came to forget. That first night, the silence gnawed at me. The wind howled, scraping against the metal sides of the RV, but it wasn't the wind that disturbed me. I tried to distract myself by checking my gear: rope, climbing harness, first aid kit. Old habits, back when I was still with search and rescue. My gear had been my lifeline, but even the best gear couldn't save everyone. I lay in the bunk, staring at the ceiling, but my thoughts kept me awake. The river's growl filled the night, an eerie, omnipresent sound that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. I'd read about the canyon's strange acoustics, how sound bounced off the cliffs, distorting even the clearest noises. They said you could hear whispers, voices that weren't there. I told myself it was just the wind, it had to be, but then I heard it. A voice. Mark. My blood went cold. I sat up, chest tight, my breath shallow. It wasn't just any voice, it was her voice. Anna. The next morning I met Elena Price, a park ranger stationed near the visitor center. Her sharp eyes and calm demeanor reminded me of the old rangers I used to work with, ones who had seen more than their fair share of horrors. "Planning to go down into the canyon?" she asked, nodding toward my climbing harness. "Just exploring," I said. She frowned. "Be careful on the trails. They're narrow, and the acoustics can mess with your head. People hear things." I nodded, brushing it off, but something in her tone stopped me. "You mean the whispers?" Her gaze flicked toward the canyon. "It's not just whispers. Some people see things too. Shadows, figures. They disappear just as quickly as they appear." Her words settled uneasily in my gut. "You believe that?" I asked. "I've seen enough not to dismiss it," she said. "Just stay on the marked paths, and if you hear something that doesn't feel right, turn back." I didn't take her advice. By midday, I was deep in the canyon, following a narrow trail that wound its way down to the river. The air grew cooler as I descended, the sunlight fading to a dim gray. The river's roar grew louder, but beneath it I heard something else, a low, rhythmic hum, like the canyon itself was breathing. I paused, catching my breath, my eyes scanning the rocks. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh. Distinct. Too large to be mine. They led off the trail, stopping abruptly at the edge of a cliff. A chill ran down my spine, but I pressed on. The first shadow appeared when I reached the riverbank. It flickered at the corner of my eye, like a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, it grew clearer. A tall, indistinct figure standing motionless across the river. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called. The figure didn't move. I crossed the river on a narrow rock bridge, boots splashing through the shallows, but when I reached the other side, the shadow was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a distortion from the canyon walls. But then I turned and saw something carved into the rock, a single word scratched deep into the stone. Why? By the time I made it back to the rim, the sun was setting. Elena was waiting for me, arms crossed. "Where'd you go?" she asked. "Down to the river," I said. Her expression hardened. "I told you to stay on the trails." "I did." I lied. She shook her head. "The canyon's not just a place. It gets inside your head. You're lucky it let you come back." I scoffed. "It's a canyon, not a haunted house." She didn't argue, but her silence was worse than any words. That night, the voices returned, louder, closer. "Mark, why did you let me go?" I bolted upright, my chest tight, the words slicing through the darkness like a blade. The voice was so familiar it made my heart ache. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling, and stepped outside. The gorge stretched out before me, a yawning black void. The wind howled through the cliffs, carrying the unmistakable sound of someone crying. I followed the sound, flashlight sweeping over the rocks, until I reached the edge of the rim. There she was, standing on the far side of the canyon. Her figure was pale, ghostly against the dark cliffs. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew who she was. "Anna." My voice cracked. She turned toward me, her face blurred by the distance, but I could never forget her. And then she was gone. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I was already halfway down the canyon, retracing my steps from the day before. I didn't care how dangerous it was. I didn't care how foolish I looked. I had to know if she was real. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, the canyon walls pressing closer, the shadows stretching out, growing darker. I saw flickers of movement at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Then the shadow appeared. It rose from the canyon floor like smoke, its form shifting, flickering, tall, featureless. Its presence was suffocating, cold, and the shadows around me seemed to writhe and twist. "You can't save her," it whispered, its voice deep and resonant. "You never could." My breath caught. The memory hit me like a wave, the storm, the fall, the rescue that had ended too late. I tried to save Anna, but I had failed. "You let her fall," the shadow hissed. "No!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I did everything I could." The shadow loomed closer, its form expanding until it blotted out the cliffs. It showed me the moment again, over and over, the slip, the scream, the silence that followed. It wasn't just a memory, it was real, and I was living it again. Then I heard her voice. "Mark." It was soft, barely audible over the shadow's growl, but it was enough. I turned, and there she was, standing on the trail. Her figure glowed faintly, it had almost ethereal. "You have to let go," she said. Tears blurred my vision. "I can't." The shadow shrieked, its form collapsing inward as Anna reached for me. Her touch was warm, solid, and in that moment, the weight I had carried for years lifted. "I forgive you," she whispered, and then, just like that, she was gone. The shadow dissolved into the canyon, its form scattering like smoke. I staggered back to the rim, my legs trembling, my chest hollow. Elena found me there, her face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. She didn't press for details. Instead, she helped me back to the RV, her presence grounding me as the canyon's whispers faded into silence. I left the Black Canyon the next morning, the shadows still heavy in my mind. but for the first time in years, I felt lighter. I don't know if the shadow will ever return, or if it's still lurking in the gorge, waiting for its next victim. But I do know this: some places don't just test your strength, they test your soul. And not everyone makes it out. I had been on the road for weeks, my RV a fragile shield from the crushing weight of grief. After my wife died, the walls at home felt like they were closing in on me. I needed to escape, to vanish into the vastness of the world and find something, anything, that would silence the constant buzz of my memories. Montana seemed like the perfect place for solitude, so I parked my RV in a remote corner of the wilderness, far from towns, far from everything. The air was thick with silence, almost oppressive, but I welcomed it. My name's Drew Carver. By trade, I'm an engineer, but in that moment, I was just a man trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. The day began like any other. I brewed a steaming cup of coffee, wandered for a short hike, and then sat by a fire with a book. The hours crawled by in their predictable rhythm, and by noon I felt the familiar itch to explore deeper. I packed my gear, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and trudged into the forest. The woods in Montana were beautiful in a haunting sort of way. Tall pines stretched into the sky, their branches intertwined to form a dark canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was fresh, the kind that filled your lungs and made you forget about the world. For the first time in months, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. The trail I followed wound through the trees, twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the wilderness. Hours passed, and I stumbled upon a small clearing with a stream snaking through it. I sank onto a rock, pulling out a sandwich. As I ate, my eyes were drawn to the ground near the stream. There were signs of struggle: broken branches, disturbed earth, and dragged marks leading away from the water. Curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I decided to follow the trail. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away, as though they, too, were holding their breath. My steps quickened, a nagging feeling crawling up my spine. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself, but something darker, lingered at the edge of my mind. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. A camp. Not a normal one. This was a place that had been abandoned, hidden behind a wall of tall shrubs and fallen branches. Old, tattered tents sagged in the shadow, their fabric shredded. A fire pit, cold and neglected, sat in the middle of the camp as if it hadn't seen flame in weeks. But what truly froze my blood was the pile of clothes. Torn, caked with dirt, yet unmistakably modern. Jeans, t-shirts, sneakers. Something about it didn't fit. No one wore those out here. Not like this. Not in this desolation. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, the pieces clicking together in a horrific puzzle. Then, out of nowhere, a voice pierced the stillness. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, and there he was. A man emerging from the trees, tall and gaunt, his eyes wild and feverish. A scraggly beard clung to his face, and his clothes were in tatters. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years. He looked like someone who had lost touch with humanity. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was low, rasping, laced with something primal. I... I'm just hiking," I stammered, my mind racing. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll leave." But he didn't listen. His eyes narrowed, flicking to the pile of clothes. "This is private property," he growled, taking a step toward me. Instinctively, I backed away, fear pooling in my gut. "I didn't know," I repeated, voice shaking. "I'll go." But he wasn't listening. With a guttural roar, he lunged at me. His hands were rough, like claws, and they dragged me to the ground. We wrestled, but my strength was no match for his frenzy. I managed to push him off, scrambling to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. Without thinking, I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, pushing through the trees, gasping for air. My thoughts were a jumble of fear and panic, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Eventually, I stopped, breath ragged, my legs trembling beneath me. I strained my ears, listening for any sounds of pursuit, but there was nothing, only the eerie rustling of the forest around me. Still, I didn't feel safe. Not yet. I stumbled my way back to the stream, following it, retracing my steps until I found the familiar trail. The light was beginning to fade, and panic gnawed at my insides. I had to get back to the RV. The thought of that man, somewhere out in the woods, following me like some sort of hunter, filled me with dread. When I finally reached the RV, the sun had dipped below the horizon. I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. My hands trembled as I tried to calm myself, but the questions gnawed at me. Who was that man? What was he doing here? And what had happened to the people who left those clothes? I tried to eat, tried to relax, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. So I sat by the window, eyes darting to the dark shapes in the forest, half expecting to see him there. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally overtook me. I drifted off to sleep, clutching a heavy flashlight, my mind flickering between nightmares and reality. Suddenly, I jolted awake. The RV was pitch black, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then I heard it, a faint rustling outside. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight, heart thudding, and crept toward the window. There, just outside, a shadow shifted. My stomach dropped as I realized it was moving, creeping around the back of the RV. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but then the door handle rattled. I froze. A chill spread through me as I imagined that man standing just on the other side, his eyes glowing with madness. I couldn't wait any longer. I flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. There, pressed against the window, was his face. His eyes were wide, wild, as if he were some twisted creature. He let out a blood-curdling scream, and with a violent crash, he slammed into the door, shaking the entire RV. I couldn't think. I didn't know what to do. I just had to get out. I bolted for the back of the RV, wrenching open the emergency exit. I leaped into the night air, landing hard, my legs screaming in protest. I didn't stop. I ran, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, but I didn't look back. I ran until I couldn't breathe anymore, until my body gave out, and then I collapsed behind a tree, too terrified to move. I stayed there, trembling, listening for any sign that he was still following. When I finally felt brave enough, I crept back toward the RV, moving as silently as I could. The door was wide open. The interior had been ransacked. Papers, clothes, and food scattered across the floor. He was gone. But I knew, deep in my bones, that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I grabbed the keys and didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The next morning, I reported everything to the police. They listened, but they didn't seem hopeful. There had been rumors of strange activity in the area, they said, but nothing concrete. They promised to investigate, but I could tell they didn't expect to find anything. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I packed my things and drove home, but the fear stayed with me, clinging to me like a shadow. Months have passed, and I still think about him, that man in the forest. Sometimes when I'm walking alone, I feel eyes on the back of my neck, and I wonder if he's still out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching me. I always said I wasn't afraid of the dark, and in a world full of attention-seeking YouTubers desperate for clicks, that made me different. I didn't want to chase likes or fame. I wanted the stories that would make people question everything they believed in. Ghosts, cryptids, legends, the real stuff. So when I came across the myth of the faceless ones, I knew I had to find them. This wasn't just some campfire tale. This was terror. Shenandoah National Park, with its dense Appalachian forests and its eerie local myths, felt like the perfect place for my next series. The faceless ones were said to be shadowy, human-shaped figures, tall, smooth, and featureless, that roamed the woods at night. The locals whispered that they led travelers off the trails and into places where no one ever returned. To most, it was just a warning to keep kids from wandering too far. But to me, it was gold. I arrived late in the afternoon. The autumn sun hung low, casting long, jagged shadows as I parked my RV at a secluded campground near Dark Hollow Falls. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, its thick trees weaving together overhead, creating an oppressive canopy. The campground was empty. Perfect. No curious campers to ruin my shots. The first night was uneventful. I set up my gear, planned my hikes for the following days, and spent hours editing footage from a previous trip. The forest was still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. Around midnight, I stepped outside to sit by the campfire. The stars shone brightly above, and the crackling of the fire was a soothing sound. Then, I heard it. A knock. Not a thud, not a bang, but a faint, rhythmic tapping. 3 knocks, soft, deliberate, spaced evenly like someone rapping their knuckles against wood. I froze. The hair on my arms stood up. My breath hitched. I scanned the forest with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just the endless rows of trees vanishing into the darkness. It's probably just an animal, I muttered, trying to shake off the chill creeping down my spine. But I couldn't deny the unease that clung to me, making the fire seem suddenly smaller, more fragile. The next morning, I took my drone out to capture aerial footage of the park. The autumn colors were stunning. The fiery reds and yellows of the trees contrasted sharply against the deep green of the mountains. As I flew the drone over a particularly dense patch of forest, something strange happened. The screen on my monitor began to glitch. Static buzzed through the speakers. The GPS signal dropped. Before I could bring it back, the drone emitted a strange, eerie whine before crashing into the woods. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my gear. The trees here were denser, their gnarled branches twisting like clawed fingers reaching toward me. I followed the drone's tracking beacon to a clearing, and what I found made my stomach churn. The grass was flattened in a perfect circle. Rocks stood upright around the edge, arranged like ancient forgotten markers. And there, in the center, lay my drone. It was completely intact. A relief, yes, but something felt wrong. A knot twisted in my gut. I stepped into the clearing. The forest went deathly still. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Nothing. I grabbed the drone, the uneasy feeling in my chest intensifying, and backed out of the clearing. Whatever this place was, I didn't want to stay to find out. That night, I went through the footage. Most of it was mundane, wide shots of the park, sweeping views of the mountains. But as the drone hovered over the clearing, I saw them. Figures. Tall, shadowy shapes standing at the edge of the trees. They weren't visible at first, but as the drone's camera zoomed in, they became clear, fading into the shadows of the trees, blending with the dark like they were part of it. They had no faces, no eyes, no mouths, just smooth, blank surfaces where their features should have been. I leaned closer to the screen, the blood in my veins turning to ice. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They just stood there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, there was a knock on the RV door. I jumped, heart hammering in my chest. The pattern was the same, 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door, expecting a prankster or maybe an animal. The campsite was empty. The wind rustled through the trees, nothing more. I slammed the door shut and locked it. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke to a tapping. This time, it wasn't on the door. It was on the window. Tap, tap, tap. The sound circled the RV, moving from one window to the next. Dat, my heart pounded in my chest as I peered through the curtains. One of them stood outside. Tall. Its body was impossibly thin, its arms too long, its fingers blackened like burnt wood. And its face, there was nothing. Just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin tilted toward me. Another knock, then another. The RV was surrounded. I backed away, mind racing. My cameras. I needed proof. I fumbled for my equipment, but when I turned it on, the screen filled with static. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. Shadows moved across the windows, stretching and twitching, like something was pressing against them from the outside. I couldn't breathe. The air grew thick, suffocating. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice trembling, but it came out weak, powerless. The knocking stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I considered leaving. My footage was a mess, but it would still make a decent video. Part of me wanted to leave, to cut my losses and never look back. But the other part, the part that craved the truth, craved the story, I couldn't walk away. I spent the day hiking, setting up more cameras, trying to capture something, anything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispers began. Soft at first, like a breeze, but they grew louder as darkness fell. They weren't animal sounds, they were voices. My voice. Chris. It wasn't an echo. It was wrong, distorted, mocking. I bolted back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. But the whispers followed, growing louder, closer, until they seemed to come from inside the RV itself. Then I heard it. Laughter. Not mine. Not anyone's I recognized. A local legend flickered to the front of my mind. Salt. Fire. The faceless ones couldn't cross it. I scrambled through my supplies, found some salt, and tore open a bundle of sage I'd packed for atmosphere. I spread a ring of salt around the RV and lit the sage rake, watching as the smoke swirled and spiraled into the night. For a moment, the whispers stopped, but then the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more violent. The walls of the RV shook as if the very earth was pounding against them. They were angry, and they were close. Sometime after midnight, the lights flickered and died. A cold draft swept through the RV. The door was open. I hadn't touched it. One of them was inside. It stood at the foot of the bed, its blank face tilted toward me like it was studying me, judging me. The air around it was suffocating, pressing against my chest, crushing the breath from my lungs. It raised a hand. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. In a final, desperate act, I grabbed the flare gun from under the bed and fired. The RV was filled with blinding red light. The creature let out a horrible, guttural screech before vanishing. The whispers stopped. I didn't pack. I didn't care about the footage. I didn't care about anything. I started the RV and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my hands shaking, my mind numb. The next morning, I deleted everything. Every video, every shot, every trace of the faceless ones. My YouTube channel went dark. I couldn't explain what happened. I didn't want to. But even now, as I sit in my apartment, I hear the faint knocking on my windows. And sometimes, in the dark, I see the shadows. They don't belong. They're still here, watching, waiting, and I don't know why. Out here, the wind has a way of whispering things that aren't there. A trick of the mind, a mockery of solitude. I exhaled, watching the smoke curl from my cigarette as I leaned back on the weathered vlog. The campsite at the edge of the dense, suffocating forest lay eerily silent. It was the kind of silence that pressed in, heavy and unnatural, so the only sound was the occasional rustle of dry leaves being blown by the wind. My name's L. Granger, and this RV camping trip was supposed to be my escape, a break from the relentless grind of daily life, a chance to disconnect, to breathe in the peacefulness of the woods. But that calm was just a veil, a deceptive prelude to the nightmare that was lurking in the shadows. I'd parked the RV in a secluded corner of the Ozarks, far from the noisy crowds of regular campers. The place was untouched, wild. A serene lake reflected the dying light of the sun, and the trees whispered secrets that begged to be uncovered. I had planned on fishing, hiking, just unwinding. That was it. Simple. But as the evening stretched on, it became clear the woods had other plans. That night, I met Dean and Jackie, two seasoned hikers, their stories painted with a mixture of excitement and eerie caution. We sat by the fire, sharing beers, laughs, and tales of the wild. They warned me about the old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a local legend among campers and teens. Stay away from it. Jackie had said, her voice serious now, the playful tone gone. People go missing around there. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a typical campfire story meant to stir up some fear. The first night passed without incident, but when morning came, I noticed something odd. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just an overwhelming silence broken only by the soft lapping of the lake's water. It didn't feel right. By late afternoon, I decided to venture into the woods. Armed with a map and my trusty Swiss Army knife, I set out on a trail that was supposed to lead to a scenic overlook. The trail started wide and well trodden, but quickly narrowed, becoming a mere suggestion of a path as the forest grew denser. Shadows thickened, the light dimmed, and the air became heavier. An hour in, I stumbled upon a clearing, and there it stood, the cabin, a grotesque silhouette against the darkening sky. It was dilapidated, as though nature itself was trying to consume it, with a sagging roof and rotting timbers. My stomach twisted, but curiosity gnawed at me. I stepped closer. The door creaked as it opened, and a musty stench rushed out to greet me. Inside, it was a graveyard of forgotten possessions, rusty lanterns, torn sleeping bags, empty cans. But then I noticed something else. A trapdoor, ajar in the center of the floor. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I knelt to lift it. I descended into the darkness, my flashlight slicing through the black void. The air grew colder and my breath became shallow. I landed in a small, dimly lit room. The floor was eerily clean. There was a cot, a table, and shelves stocked with canned food and bottled water. I froze, the blood draining from my face. This wasn't a camping stash. It was a prison. Suddenly, a faint shuffle behind me. My heart lurched, and I spun around. There, standing at the base of the ladder, was a man. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt and unshaven. His eyes were hollow, dead. He stared at me without a word. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Before I could react, he lunged, his thin frame surprisingly strong. We struggled, his hands like iron around my throat, his breath hot on my face. Panic surged through me, and with a desperate shove, I broke free, scrambling up the ladder, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't look back as I bolted into the forest, running blindly until I reached the RV, breathless, shaken to my core. I locked myself inside, but something was wrong. The RV wouldn't start. The engines sputtered and died. I tried again, and again. Nothing. I was trapped. Hours dragged on as night fell. The forest outside turned pitch black, alive with unseen dangers. My flashlight flickered, casting long, warped shadows across the interior. That's when I heard it. The soft, steady crunch of footsteps outside. Closer. Louder. And then, knock, knock, knock. "Open up," a voice called. It wasn't the man from the cabin. I peered through the window and saw two figures standing in the dark. One held a shotgun. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "We're looking for our friend," the man with the shotgun said coldly. "He went missing around here." I hesitated but finally opened the door a crack. "I haven't seen anyone." The man's eyes narrowed, suspicious. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "Yes, I do," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The other man, bulkier and taller, stepped forward. "We won't take long," he said, before shoving the door open, barging past me. They quickly searched the RV, rifling through my things, their eyes cold and calculating. When they were done, the shorter one glanced at me one last time. "If you see anything, let us know. People go missing around here." I slammed the door shut behind them, my hands trembling as I bolted the locks. Something wasn't right. Everything felt wrong. I couldn't stay another night. Grabbing a few essentials, I planned to leave on foot. The nearest town was miles away, but what choice did I have? As I stepped outside, my heart stopped. In the dirt near the cabin, half hidden by leaves, was a hand. A human hand. I uncovered the rest of the body. It was the man from the underground room. His neck was twisted at a sickening angle. Panic shot through me. I had to get out. I had to call the cops. I ran, my breath ragged, my legs burning as I plunged through the woods. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every shadow made my pulse spike. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flickering light of Dean and Jackie's campfire in the distance. I collapsed, breathless, as I shouted, "Help! There's a body," back at my camp. Dean and Jackie emerged from their tent, alarmed. "We need to call the cops," I told them, and they didn't hesitate. Dean dialed 911 as I told them everything: the man in the underground room, the two men with the shotgun, the body I found. We didn't have to wait long. The sirens, distant at first, grew louder, and soon two patrol cars screeched to a halt. Officers emerged, weapons drawn, their faces grim. They questioned me, then headed to the campsite. I stayed with Dean and Jackie, my nerves a frayed mess. The officers returned with even worse news. They'd found the body and the signs of a violent struggle inside the cabin. One of the officers turned to me. "We need you to come with us to the station for a statement." I didn't hesitate. I had to leave. Dean and Jackie followed in their car as we drove to the station, but a chill settled deep in my bones. This wasn't over. The man in the underground room, the two strangers. There were too many unanswered questions. At the station, I gave my full statement. The officers took it seriously, promising a full investigation. They informed me that several people had gone missing in the area over the past few years, all under strange, similar circumstances. Days later, the story hit the news. Police discovered more bodies buried near the cabin, each one in various stages of decay. It was clear now a serial killer had been hunting these woods for years. The man from the underground room had been one of the missing hikers. The others, too, were all connected to previous disappearances. But the killer remained at large. The men with the shotgun? Never found. Their connection to the murders was never fully understood. The mystery loomed like a dark cloud over the entire town. The police never found the killer. They never found the two men with the shotgun. And me, I never went back to those woods. But the nightmare haunted me. The truth had been too much. And the memory of those trees standing tall, silent, watching would never leave me. There's something unnervingly quiet about the desert. The vast emptiness, so tranquil at first, eventually becomes suffocating, like the weight of the world pressing against your chest. The silence is not peaceful, it's unnatural. That's why I came here. I needed to breathe. The RV rumbled into the campground as the sun dipped below the jagged mesas, splashing orange and purple across the sky. The place was as remote as I had hoped. No cell service, no other campers, not even a ranger station. Just me, the shifting sands, and the harsh silhouettes of the mesas cutting into the horizon. This was supposed to be my retreat after the divorce, away from the suffocating walls of my apartment, away from the constant noise of city life. Monument Valley, with its sweeping vistas and promises of solitude, seemed like the perfect escape. The campground was barren, stripped of any comforts. 3 gravel lots marked by weathered signs, a single fire pit, a picnic table warped from years of exposure to the unrelenting sun. I parked in the middle lot, set up a folding chair, and leaned back, staring at the sinking sun. It should have been calming. But that first night, the silence gnawed at me. As I flipped on the RV's generator, the hum sputtered weakly and the lights flickered before cutting out entirely. I stepped outside to check the generator, but as soon as the door creaked open, the desert night swallowed me whole. Then I heard it, a high-pitched scream, distant and unnatural. I froze, trying to place the sound, but it was wrong, too sharp, too human. The scream came again, louder, angrier. It echoed off the mesas, reverberating through the dry air, impossible to pinpoint. Coyotes, I told myself, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I had heard coyotes before. This was something else. The next morning, I forced myself to ignore the unease that had settled in my gut. The desert was beautiful in the daylight. Its harsh beauty was overwhelming, the mesas casting long shadows over the red sand. I set out on foot to explore, eager to distract myself with the emptiness. There were trails nearby, though not marked, and the terrain was easy to navigate. An hour into my hike, I stumbled upon something strange. A circle of smooth stones, half buried in the sand, arranged in an unnervingly perfect symmetry. In the center lay a scattering of bones, small animal bones, maybe birds. I approached, my curiosity overpowering my instincts. But as I stepped inside the circle, the air shifted. It was heavier there, like a thick, oppressive blanket, despite the dry desert heat. My stomach churned. I snapped a photo, but as I did, a wave of nausea crashed over me. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I backed out of the circle quickly, shaking the sensation off as dehydration. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't it. When I returned to the RV, the heat had become suffocating. The generator wouldn't start. I cursed under my breath, fiddling with the wires and trying again, but it was dead. No lights, no air conditioning. The fridge was useless. Sweat poured down my back as I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the endless stretch of empty road, too far to walk. No one else around to help. As night fell, the unease returned. Stronger, sharper, like a knife twisting in my chest. I lit a small fire outside, hoping it would push back the isolation gnawing at me, but the desert had changed. The silence was no longer just silence. It was wrong. The usual sounds of the wilderness, the chirping crickets, the rustling wind, even the distant howls of coyotes, had vanished. The fire crackled weakly, its sound swallowed by the heavy stillness. Then the screaming came again. But this time it was closer, desperate. A low, guttural wail that tore through the air, sending a chill down my spine. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I scanned the darkness. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. The scream stopped, cut off abruptly, and was replaced by faint, whispering voices, too soft to understand but unmistakably angry. The flashlight beam swung across the desert, cutting through the darkness, and there, on the edge of a mesa, was a figure, motionless, a silhouette standing against the moonlit sky. I froze. "Hey!" I called, my voice rising with growing dread. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, unnaturally still like a statue. I took a step forward, then another. The beam flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Inside the RV, I locked the doors and sat by the window, staring out at the fire pit. The shadows from the dying flames seemed to shift, twisting into shapes that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. The door creaked. My heart stopped. I was sure I had locked it. I grabbed a wrench from the toolbox and cautiously approached. The door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. The air inside was freezing, despite the desert's oppressive heat. On the floor leading from the door to the back of the RV were tracks of dirt, large, irregular smears. They stopped abruptly in the middle of the floor, as though whatever had entered simply vanished. I couldn't stay another moment. I packed what little I could into a backpack and began walking, following the dirt road back toward the highway. But the desert was cruel. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the mesas seemed to shift, their shapes blurring together until I couldn't tell where I was. Hours passed, and with growing dread, I realized I hadn't gotten any closer to the highway. Somehow, I had returned to the campground. That night, the entity revealed itself. I built another fire, praying it would keep whatever haunted the desert at bay. But the darkness around the campground deepened, as though the shadows themselves were watching. And then I saw it. It stepped out from the edge of the firelight, its body shifting, translucent, like smoke trapped in the shape of a man. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its face, it was my face. The thing grinned, its expression twisted into something grotesque. "Ethan," it rasped, its voice an agonized echo of my own. I stumbled backward, clutching the wrench like a lifeline. The entity moved slowly, deliberately, flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Desperate, I remembered the stone circle. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, the growls of the thing vibrating in my chest as it pursued me. When I reached the circle, I collapsed to my knees, fumbling for the small bundle of sage I had packed. I lit it, waving it over the circle, chanting the first words that came to my mind, "Leave me alone." The entity stopped at the edge of the stones, its form writhing in pain as though my words were burning it. For a moment, I thought it would retreat. Then it lunged. I woke at dawn, sprawled at the edge of the circle. The entity was gone, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight in the air. My body ached, my throat raw, but I stumbled back toward the campground, the sun burning down on me. Rangers found me later that day, dehydrated and delirious. I told them about the RV, the screams, the entity, but they dismissed it as heat stroke induced hallucinations. But when I reviewed the photos on my camera back home, one image stood out. It was the stone circle, and in the background, just behind me, was the shadowy form of the entity, its eyes glowing yellow. No one ever expects a casual trip to turn into a nightmare, yet that's exactly what happened to me. What was supposed to be a simple RV camping trip near the Sierra Nevada quickly spiraled into a terrifying ordeal that will haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Will Aaron, and this is the story of how a relaxing getaway turned into a fight for survival, all in the span of a single day. It started innocently enough. My buddy Tom and I had been planning this trip for weeks, eager to escape the grind of city life. We packed up my aging RV with supplies, fishing gear, and more beer than we could possibly drink in a week. The drive was smooth, the views breathtaking, as we wound our way deeper into the mountains. The pine trees seemed to stretch toward the heavens, and the air was crisp, as fresh and untouched as nature itself. We found the perfect spot by a secluded lake miles away from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where you could truly lose yourself in the serenity, a place that seemed almost too perfect to be real. After setting up camp, we started a fire and cracked open a couple of beers. As night descended, the sky revealed a blanket of stars so vivid it almost felt unnatural. Tom, ever the jokester, started telling scary stories, cheesy tales about things that go bump in the night. We laughed it off, not realizing how close we were to real danger. The following morning, we decided to hike deeper into the woods to find a good fishing spot. The trail quickly grew narrow and overgrown, with branches snagging at our clothes like hidden hands. After a few hours of walking, we stumbled upon something strange, a decaying, abandoned cabin. The windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges, swaying like a silent invitation. Despite the unsettling feeling that crept up my spine, curiosity got the better of us. We ventured inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with old newspapers and magazines from the 1980s. It was as if time had forgotten this place entirely. But there was something off, something I couldn't put my finger on. The whole cabin felt wrong, like a dead thing that had been left to fester in the wilderness. Tom made light of it, cracking jokes to mask the tension, but I couldn't shake the creeping sense of dread that had settled in my chest. We moved further inside, and in the far corner of the room, we found a trapdoor leading to a cellar. It was locked, but Tom, always resourceful, pried it open with a crowbar. The cellar smelled like rot, thick and cloying, like something had died down there a long time ago. We shone our flashlights into the darkness. Jars of what looked like pickled vegetables lined the shelves, but there were also rusted tools scattered among them, tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. One tool, an old axe, stood out. It was smeared with something dark, too dark to be rust. The air in the cellar was suffocating, and the feeling of being watched pressed against us like a physical force. We left the cellar as quickly as we had entered, closing the trapdoor behind us. But when we returned to our campsite, everything had changed. Our RV door was wide open. We were sure we'd locked it before we left. Inside, the place was a wreck. Our supplies were scattered across the floor as if someone had been searching for something, but nothing was missing. Whoever had been inside didn't care about money or possessions. They were after something else. That night, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every crackle of the fire, Every rustle in the woods made our hearts race. Around midnight, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. We called out, thinking it might be another camper or a lost hiker. No answer. Tom grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees. For a moment, the beam revealed nothing but the endless blackness of the forest. Then we saw him. A man, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the tree line. His clothes were ragged, his face obscured by shadow. But his eyes, those eyes glinted in the flashlight's beam, cold and unblinking, like two pits of darkness. Tom shouted at him, demanding he leave. But the man didn't move. He simply turned slowly and vanished into the woods. We couldn't breathe. We didn't sleep that night. By dawn, we packed up in silence, eager to escape the terror that had taken root in the very air. As we loaded the RV, Tom noticed something on the ground near the fire pit, a piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a list of names, some crossed out, but the last two, Tom and Will, were fresh. I felt my blood run cold. We had to leave, immediately. As we sped down the mountain road, desperate to put miles between ourselves and whatever horror we had stumbled upon, we saw him again. The man. He stood in the middle of the road, his figure backlit by the headlights. I swerved, my heart pounding, and nearly crashed into a tree. But when I glanced back, he was gone. We didn't stop until we reached a small town where we reported everything to the local police. They listened, but their skepticism was palpable. They promised to check out the campsite and the cabin, but their dismissive tone made it clear they thought we were either pranking them or overreacting. A few days later, we received a call from the police. They had found the cabin, but no sign of the man. However, they had discovered the trapdoor and the cellar. What they found down there was beyond anything we could have imagined. Human remains. Some recent, some decades old. It was a makeshift tomb for the killer's victims. Tom and I were in shock. The police assured us they were launching a full investigation, but their words felt hollow. The reality of what we had stumbled upon was too much to comprehend. We had come so close to becoming part of that grim collection. Months passed, but the memory never faded. The man's eyes, gleaming in the dark, haunted my every waking moment. The police never found him, and the case went cold. But Tom and I knew the truth. He was still out there, watching, waiting for his next victim, and we had barely escaped his grasp. I always thought the Pine Barrens were just trees and sand, a stretch of wilderness where the air smelled faintly of stagnant swamp water. Nothing sinister, nothing worth fearing. I grew up hearing stories about the Jersey Devil, but they were just campfire tales, absurdities to pass the time. No one took them seriously. But now, as I sit here in the flickering light of my broken RV, scratching at claw marks gouged into the metal, I know better. It began 3 days ago. The Pine Barrens seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. I had left behind everything, the suffocating office job, the tiny apartment that felt more like a cage than a home, the hollow ache left by a broken heart. I bought an old RV, slung a camera around my neck, and hit the road, hoping to escape the suffocating weight of my past. When I arrived, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The pines rose like dark spires, their silhouettes jagged against the sky. I parked the RV on a sandy clearing, far from any hiking trail. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, the kind of solitude I needed to breathe again. The first day passed in peaceful silence. I spent the afternoon hiking, snapping photos of gnarled trees and the odd deer trail. The quiet was unlike anything I'd ever known. It wasn't just the absence of human noise. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness, a silence that wrapped itself around me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I convinced myself it was natural. But deep down, something about it unsettled me. That night, the trouble began. I was lying in bed, scrolling through the photos I had taken, when I heard it, a long, low scream that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the cry of a fox or the hoot of an owl. This sound was guttural, a chilling mixture between a growl and a wail, like it came from the throat of something massive and unnatural. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, holding my breath as I listened. Then a heavy thud, the sound of something large stomping through the sand just outside my RV. My pulse shot into my throat. I sat up quickly and switched off the lights, my hand trembling over the curtain, unwilling to look, terrified of what might be waiting outside. The footsteps circled the RV, heavy and deliberate. Then they faded, sinking into the woods like something monstrous slipping back into the shadows. I stayed awake for hours, my mind racing, listening for any sign of movement. But eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, camera hanging from my neck, and at first, everything seemed normal. The clearing was still, a thin layer of mist clinging to the ground like a ghostly shroud. But then I saw them, massive hoof prints, far larger than any deer's, their deep impressions revealing the weight of whatever had made them. They circled the RV, a loose spiral, before disappearing into the woods. Probably just a wild animal, I told myself, my voice hollow as though I was trying to convince my own mind. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. I spent the day wandering deeper into the barrens, trying to shake the unease settling over me. But my camera, once my trusted companion, began to malfunction. It refused to focus properly, and when it did take a picture, the images came out distorted, full of strange smudges and shadows that didn't belong. I almost welcomed the distraction. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand. I tried to set up a fire, hoping the warmth would ease my growing dread, but the silence was suffocating. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches like fingers reaching toward me. That night, the footsteps came again. This time they were slower, more deliberate, pacing outside my RV as though something terrible was circling me, waiting. Then came the scratching. It started low, near the bottom of the door, a slow, deliberate scrape of claws against metal. My blood ran cold and I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The scratching moved higher, closer to the window, and then breathing, shallow, wet, almost like a sigh, right on the other side of the glass. I didn't dare move. I held my breath, praying it would go away. And then, nothing. The sound stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there, gripping the flashlight as though it could somehow protect me. The next morning, I found the scratches, deep gouges running along the side of the RV. Their edges were jagged, torn like the claws of some great beast. Whatever had done this wasn't just toying with me. It was sending a message. It was testing me, letting me know it was watching. I wanted to leave, to flee before whatever hunted me struck again, but I stayed. I had come here to escape, to clear my mind, and I refused to let a few creepy noises drive me out. That afternoon, I found the cabin. It was deep in the woods, hidden behind a thick tangle of brush. The roof had caved in, and the walls were warped with age, but something about it drew me in. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with mildew and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and a charred stone fireplace jutted out from one wall. But what truly caught my attention were the carvings. The walls, the floors, even the ceiling. They were covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Eyes, spirals, jagged lines etched deep into the wood, words repeated over and over, scratched hastily, like a desperate cry for help. It feeds on fear. In the corner, I found a journal. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was frantic, shaking, barely legible. The devil watches me at night. I hear it calling my name. Fire keeps it away. My blood ran cold. That night, the creature outside wasn't subtle. It didn't pace. It didn't scratch. It slammed into the RV with enough force to shake it. The sound reverberated through the metal walls like a thunderclap. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, trembling in the center of the RV. The walls rattled again, and then came the distinct sound of claws scraping against the roof, tearing through the metal. Then the voice. Mark. Low. Guttural. Spoken slowly as if savoring my name, echoing both inside my head and outside, reverberating through the night. I sank to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. The voice was inside me now, echoing, relentless. Fire! The journal's words burned through my mind, and I moved without thinking. My hands grabbed the propane canister from the small stove, rigging it with a lighter. I stood, trembling, near the door, holding my makeshift flamethrower, knowing deep down that it was my only chance. The voice came again. Mark, come outside. The RV groaned under the weight of whatever pressed against it. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I threw open the door. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, empty, still, until I saw it. The creature was massive, its hunched form towering above me. It had the body of a man, but twisted, covered in thick, matted fur. Its legs ended in massive hooves, and its eyes glowed a sickening red. The Jersey Devil. It stared at me, its head tilting unnaturally as though studying me. Then it lunged. I didn't think. I just fired. The flame roared to life, lighting up the clearing, sending the creature howling into the darkness. The fire burned in its path, but it wasn't enough. The creature retreated, but not before letting out a final, deafening screech. I kept the flame going, backing toward the RV, my hand shaking violently. The creature screamed again, the sound fading as it disappeared into the trees. By morning, I was gone. The RV was damaged, but still functional. I didn't look back as I drove out of the Pine Barrens. The claw marks on the RV, the journal, the photos on my camera, all the proof of what I had seen were enough to keep me away forever. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I still hear its voice in my dreams. Mark. I pulled into the campground just before dusk, my RV rattling against the uneven gravel road. Shasta Lake stretched out to my left, its surface unnaturally still, catching the dying light like a dark mirror, reflecting a beauty so haunting it made my chest ache. It was the same beauty I once shared with her, the same shimmering surface that had swallowed Natalie 3 years ago. Not this lake, but one like it, an identical mirror, reflecting our love in its stillness. Too much wine, a late night swim, a moment of carelessness. I should have stopped her. I should have done something, anything. But I didn't. Guilt clawed at me as it always did, and that's why I was here, alone in this remote corner of Northern California, far from anyone I knew. I needed space, they said. Space to think, to let go. But I wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. The first night passed in eerie silence. I set up camp by the shore, close enough to hear the water lapping gently against the rocks. The air was crisp, the sky clear and dotted with stars. It should have been peaceful, but a weight of dread hung over me, heavy as the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling of her presence, even after all this time. I fell asleep, but sleep was not kind to me. I dreamed of Natalie. She stood in the water, her long, wet hair clinging to her face. She smiled at me, the same radiant smile I had once fallen for. But her eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too dark, and they seemed to pull me in. Her voice whispered over the water, soft, melodic, and wrong. Come in. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. Her voice echoed in my ears, distant and haunting. I lay there, breathless, trying to shake the image of her from my mind, but it clung to me like cold water. The next day, I spent hours sketching by the lake, trying to push the memory of that smile away, but the stillness of the water unnerved me. It was too quiet, too perfect. It didn't feel like nature. It felt like a trap. The surface was so smooth, so flawless, that it almost seemed to mock the world above it. I tried to focus on my drawing, the play of light and shadow on the water, but my sketches twisted into something else. No matter how hard I tried to stay focused, the shapes shifted, reforming into her, into her. By late afternoon, the isolation was starting to gnaw at me. I needed a break, some sign of life to break the suffocating solitude. I wandered up the trail toward the main campground, hoping for anyone. The first site I passed was abandoned, the fire pit cold and scattered with half-burned logs. The second was the same, but when I reached the third, a man was hurriedly packing up his things, his face pale and drawn. "Hey!" I called out, raising a hand. "Leaving already?" He glanced at me, his eyes wide with fear. "You should leave too," he said, his voice low and shaky. "This place isn't right." Before I could ask him what he meant, he threw his pack into the back of his truck and sped off, tires kicking up a cloud of dust. That night, I sat by the fire, the flames casting long shadows across the campsite. I stared into the dancing flames, but it didn't take long before I heard them, the whispers. Faint at first, like a lullaby sung from a great distance. The melody was soft, soothing, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. The whispers grew louder, their voices weaving together into a haunting song. Then one voice, one word cut through the rest: Ryan. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. My name. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking, and stumbled toward the shore, my beam cutting through the darkness. The water stretched out before me, empty, black, silent. But then, far out in the lake, I saw her, a figure swimming, her hair trailing behind her like a dark veil. Natalie? My voice trembled. The figure stopped, slowly turning to face me. Even from a distance, I saw her smile. Too wide, too knowing. "Come in," she called, her voice carrying across the water, soft and beckoning. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my grip, the beam jerking across the ground as I fumbled to pick it up. But by the time my hands closed around it, she was gone. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some trick of the mind, exhaustion, grief, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I couldn't deny what I had seen. And when I opened my sketch pad, I froze. There on the page was Natalie, standing in the lake, her hand outstretched, smiling at me. The lines were too precise, too detailed. I hadn't drawn this, not consciously. By the third night, I couldn't escape the song. It was everywhere, inside my head, outside in the wind, weaving through the walls of the RV. I covered my ears, retreating into the safety of the RV, but the melody seeped through, wrapping around me like a suffocating cocoon. Then the temperature dropped suddenly, and my breath fogged in the cold air. Ryan. The voice was behind me now. I turned slowly, dread tightening in my chest. There she stood, Natalie, in the doorway. She was dripping wet, her hair plastered to her face. She looked just as I remembered her, but wrong. Her skin was an unnatural shade of pale, bluish, and cold. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, vacant. "Come with me," she whispered, her lips curling into that familiar smile. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn, to escape, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen. She stepped closer, her footsteps leaving wet prints on the floor. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice sweet and soothing. "We'll be together again." Her hand reached for mine, clammy and cold. I felt myself drawn to her, despite everything. But then I saw it, her reflection in the window. It wasn't her. The figure in the glass was monstrous, its skin translucent and stretched tight, revealing the skeletal structure beneath. Its hair rose like seaweed, its eyes glowing with a predatory light. The smile was twisted, cruel. I recoiled, stumbling back, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature's face twisted in rage, and it let out a guttural scream so loud it shook the RV. I don't remember how I made it through the night. I huddled in the corner, clutching a can of pepper spray as though it could save me. The song faded with the first light of dawn, but its echo lingered in my ears, a reminder of what I had seen. I couldn't stay. I packed up quickly, hands trembling as I shoved everything into the RV. When I stepped outside, the lake was perfectly still, its surface smooth as glass, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was standing at the edge of the lake, her figure reflected in the water, smiling. Months later, the song still haunts me. It creeps into my dreams, pulling me back to that place, back to her. I haven't painted since that trip, and I avoid water whenever I can. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see her reflection in the glass, waiting, watching, waiting for me to slip. I never truly understood the terror of solitude until I found myself deep in the heart of Arapaho National Forest, miles away from civilization. Just me, my RV, and the endless wilderness. My name is Ellis Grady, and I've always been drawn to the isolation of nature. Something about it calms the chaos in my mind. This trip was supposed to be my escape, a chance to unwind, to hunt, to feel at peace again. I parked my RV in a secluded corner of the forest beside a crystal clear stream that wound its way through the trees like a ribbon of glass. The air was fresh, scented with pine, and the distant call of birds felt like nature's lullaby. Perfect. I set up camp, routine now, leveling the RV, unhooking the ATV, and securing my hunting gear. The world around me was untouched, silent but for the occasional rustling of wind in the treetops. After a simple meal of canned beans and beef jerky, I climbed onto the ATV to explore. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing through the mountains as I raced through the rugged trails. The views were breathtaking. Vast, untamed Rockies stretching out before me, bathed in the soft glow of sunset. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I turned back, the fading light casting eerie shadows on the trees. I felt exhilarated, alive, until the darkness descended. Night fell swiftly, bringing a biting cold that gnawed at my bones. I built a small fire, its flickering flames casting distorted, dancing shadows across the forest floor. As I sat there, the comforting crackle of the fire was the only sound, just me and the wilderness. But the longer I stared into the flames, the more uneasy I became. The forest, usually so alive with the hum of insects and the call of birds, was unnervingly silent. I shook it off as nothing more than nerves and retreated to the warmth of the RV. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and I buried myself in the covers, trying to sleep. But then a sound, a sharp, grating noise, cut through the stillness. It was distant but unmistakable, something heavy scraping along the forest floor. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and stepped out into the cold, the beam of light slicing through the blackness. The forest was eerily still, the silence pressing in around me. I scanned the area around the RV. Nothing. I circled the vehicle, my pulse pounding in my ears, but still, nothing. Finally, I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks and went back inside, my heart still racing. The next morning, I decided to get some distance, to hunt and clear my mind. I packed my rifle and supplies and set off on foot. The forest, bathed in soft morning light, looked peaceful again, almost inviting. I tracked deer for hours, the thrill of the hunt keeping my senses sharp. But as the day wore on, I found myself far deeper in the forest than I intended. That's when I stumbled upon it. A clearing, and in its center an old wooden structure, a cabin, crude and haphazardly built from logs and branches. Something about it felt wrong. I approached cautiously, a chill creeping up my spine. Inside, it was a ghostly scene, old, musty furniture and a rusted metal box. It felt abandoned, forgotten, like the air hadn't moved in years. I opened the box, expecting nothing. Instead, I found only some decaying papers and a knife. Just as I turned to leave, a sensation, a primal, bone-deep feeling hit me. I was being watched. I bolted from the cabin, my every step echoing in the silence. As I neared my camp, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. Fresh footprints. Large, heavy prints leading directly to my RV. I crouched down, inspecting the ground. There were signs of a struggle, deep impressions in the dirt. My pulse surged. Had someone been tracking me? Or worse, was someone still waiting for me at my camp? I gripped my rifle and approached the RV cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could hear faint sounds from inside, scraping, rummaging. My breath caught in my throat. I kicked the door open, gun raised, ready for whatever nightmare awaited me. What I saw inside stopped me dead in my tracks. A man, disheveled, wild-eyed, with matted hair, was rifling through my supplies. His face twisted into a maddened grin as he turned to face me. His eyes were unhinged, burning with something dark. Before I could react, he lunged at me, a rusted knife gripped in his hand. I fired. The shot rang out like a thunderclap in the confined space of the RV. He crumpled to the floor, the knife skittering across the floorboards. My hands shook, the weight of what I'd just done crashing over me. I had just killed a man. I checked his pulse. Dead. My mind raced. Who was he? What was he doing in my RV? I rifled through his pockets, my hands trembling. I found a crumpled piece of paper, a list of names, dates, and my name. Today's date was marked beside it. The realization hit like a hammer. He had been hunting me. Panic set in. I had to leave, now. I grabbed what I could, shoved it into the RV, and floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. But even as I raced through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. I drove straight to the nearest town, Granby, my mind a whirlwind. I went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Logan, a grizzled man with a no-nonsense attitude, listened quietly as I explained everything. "We need to investigate the site," he said, after a long silence. "You said you found a cabin. Can you show us?" I nodded, too numb to argue. The sheriff and two deputies followed me back to the camp. The drive felt suffocating, the weight of the encounter hanging over us. When we arrived, they immediately secured the area. I led them to the cabin, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was exactly as I had left it, but it felt wrong, more sinister now, like something that had been waiting for us. The sheriff examined it, then turned to me with a grim look. "This cabin, it's not on any maps. It's like it doesn't exist." We returned to the RV, where the deputies had already begun inspecting the body. They found more papers in his pockets, symbols, drawings, an incoherent mess. It was like something out of a madman's diary. "This guy was a real nutcase," muttered the sheriff. "We'll take it from here, Ellis. You should get some rest." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. I checked into a motel in Granby, my mind still reeling. The peace I once found in solitude was now a prison. Every creak of the building, every shadow felt like it was watching me. I couldn't escape the feeling that the danger wasn't over. The next morning, the sheriff called. They'd identified the man. Walter Brackett, a drifter with a long history of mental illness and violent behavior. He'd been linked to several missing persons cases in the area, but the police had never been able to tie him to anything concrete. It seemed he'd been living in that cabin, hunting campers like me. "You're lucky to be alive," the sheriff said. "We found more names on that list. We're contacting their families. If you hadn't acted, who knows what he would have done." I hung up, his words sinking in. I had survived, but I wasn't the same. The forest, once a place of solitude, now held dark memories. The RV, the hunting, the silence. It had all turned into something more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I packed my things, left Granby behind, and headed back to the city, but even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees lining the road seemed to hide shadows, and I swore I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked, there was nothing. The mountains faded in my rearview mirror, replaced by the familiar sights of civilization. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I would never forget my time in Arapaho National Forest. The solitude that almost became my undoing, and the man who turned my peaceful retreat into a waking nightmare.